The play begins with the conversation of the two servants, Fag and Thomas. Fag tells Thomas that he no longer works for Jack Absolute and his new master is Ensign Beverly. He explains that Absolute has taken on the identity of an ensign to court Lydia Languish. Mrs. Malaprop, one of the major characters of the play The Rivals and the guardian of Lydia Languish, has discovered their love affair and stopped Lydia from communicating with her lover Beverly, as Malaprop thinks that an ensign is an unsuitable match for Lydia. Mr. Anthony Absolute, a father of Jack Absolute or Captain Absolute, visit Mrs. Malaprop and together they scold Lydia for her interest in Beverly. Anthony actually argues that girls should be illiterate and blames such disobedience in a girl on reading. Sir Anthony and Mrs. Malaprop want Lydia to get married to Jack Absolute and they discuss how to convince these young people to accept the match. And after Sir Anthony left, Mrs. Malaprop thinks on her own secret love affair with Sir Lucius Otriger and with whom she is corresponding under the pen name Delia. Mrs. Malaprop worries about how Lydia found out her secret affair. She asks Lucy, her maid, if she told Lydia, which Lucy denies. Mrs. Malaprop then gives Lucy another letter for Sir Lucius. Unfortunately, Sir Lucius has no interest in Mrs. Malaprop, but he has been led by the wily maid Lucy to believe that Delia is Lydia's pen name, but actually it was Mrs. Malaprop's name. And it was also the cunning Lucy who revealed the love affair of Lydia and Beverly to Malaprop. And once she is alone, Lucy reflects on how much profit she has made in tips and gift delivering letters for all these lovers. Bob Eckers, one of the rivals who knows nothing about Absolute's courtship of Lydia, describes to Absolute his own ridiculous attempt to become more fashionable as he tries to court Lydia. And a bit later, Sir Anthony arrives and tells Absolute that he wants to make his son's fortune by marrying him to someone of his choice. Absolute responds that he is already in love and cannot obey his father. Meanwhile, Lucy delivers a letter from Delia to Sir Lucius, and Lucius still believes that Delia is Lydia. And Fag discovers all this and threatens Lucy to tell Beverly that she is acting on behalf of Sir Lucius. But Lucy explains that the letters actually come from Mrs. Malaprop and the woman Beverly loves and the woman his father intends him to marry are one and the same person. And without disclosing that he is already courting Lydia as Ensign Beverly, Absolute promises to marry any woman his father wants him to marry. Falkland, friend of Captain Absolute and the hero of the Julia Falkland underplot, suspects Julia's sincerity and tries to invent all sorts of causes. His brain is fertile in misinterpreting Julia's noble words. Julia asks Falkland why he does not seem happy to see her, and to which he says that he had heard she had been happy without him. And she says she only put on happy face so that her friends would not blame him for making her unhappy. And in the next scene, Captain Absolute goes to visit Mrs. Malaprop at her lodgings. Mrs. Malaprop is impressed with his appearance and he flatters her. She pulls out a letter from Beverly, actually it was from Absolute, and they read it together. In the letter, Beverly mocks Mrs. Malaprop's ridiculous misuse of language. And Absolute asks if he may meet Lydia. And Mrs. Malaprop calls Lydia down and departs. Lydia is shocked to see her lover Beverly. And Beverly tells that he posed as Absolute so as to be allowed to see her. Mrs. Malaprop eavesdrops and misunderstands that Lydia is rejecting Absolute. So she intervenes and sends Lydia out of the room. Then happens a conversation between Sir Lucius Otriger and Sir Eckers. Eckers actually says to Lucius that he has an interest in Lydia Languish, but she is now courted by someone called Beverley. And Lucius convinces Eckers to write a letter to Beverley and start a duel with him. Eckers is very nervous at the prospect, and also his servant David is trying to stop him from writing a letter to Beverly and starting a duel with him. Anyway, Akers is determined to push forward with the prospect, and then Absolute arrives, and Akers asks Absolute to deliver the letter to Beverly since he knows Absolute and Beverly are acquainted. Sir Anthony Absolute, Jack Absolute, Mrs. Malaprop, Lydia Languish, all of them come together in the next scene, and Absolute finally realizes that his secret is bound to be discovered, and all of them realize that Absolute has deceived them all. And Mrs. Malaprop is shocked that Absolute is the person who wrote the letter by mocking her. And however, Lydia is very furious that Absolute deceived her. Absolute walks by muttering about his ruined hopes, and there Sir Lucius sports him, and giving no explanation to him, he challenges him to a duel. And Absolute actually tried to understand the reason, but he couldn't. And then he agrees to duel Sir Lucius that night. Absolute then runs to Falkland and explains to him everything and asks him to be his second in the duel. The servant Fag then enters with Mrs. Malaprop and tells the ladies that Falkland, Absolute, Sir Lucius, and Akers all are to be involved in a duel. They all rush off to try to stop it. On Kingsmead Fields, a little out of town, Akers and St. Lucius await their dueling opponents. Falkland and Absolute approach, and Sir Lucius assumes that Falkland is Beverly, but Akers recognizes that neither man is Beverly, and Lucius then encourages Akers to fight Falkland, but he refuses. And Absolute there confesses that Beverly was a false identity he had taken on, and says that he is willing to fight Akers in Beverly's stead. Akers still refuses to fight, and Lucius calls Akers a coward, and he accepts the insult without challenging him. Other characters also enter, and Malaprop says that Lydia is terrified and urges Lydia to tell Absolute that she still loves him. Lydia then speaks up, saying that she loves Absolute, and Sir Lucius then produces a love letter from Delia and demands whether Lydia wrote it. Lydia denies writing it, and Mrs. Malaprop confesses that she is actually Delia, and Sir Lucius is not interested in marrying Mrs. Malaprop, and he says he forgoes his claim to Lydia. Sir Anthony advises Julia to marry Falkland, promising that his jealous temperament will improve after they are married, and Akers promised to throw a party for the newly engaged couple. The character Mrs. Malaprop has become immortal and has given a word to literature that is malapropism. And her name actually indicates what she stands for. For the word malaprop stands for anything said unreasonably or unsuitably. And she is a type having no special feature except that she is expert in the most improper use of words. And these come most naturally from her mouth. Other characters also are there in literature have used words in an improper context, but none of them has been held up to ridicule like Mrs. Malaprop. She is a kind that under her very nose things are happening which she cannot see, or if she sees, she cannot diagnose correctly. Mrs. Malaprop occupies a prominent place in the portrait gallery of comic characters in the world literature. Her muddle-headedness, loquacity, self-conceit, egoism, consciousness of superior knowledge, all of them make her an unforgettable character. Although she is not the heroine of the play, she gains more attention and evokes more interest than any other character in the drama. Mrs. Malaprop is a monumental instance of Sheridan's highly developed artificial humor. And as a satirical portrait, she stands for a type of women at the age, and she is attempting to be a town lady by her unconscious and wrong use of words. And secondly, the type of an old aunt who is actually jealous to her niece, and a type of old husband hunting woman who thinks herself charming enough to attract men. Sheridan may have taken his model for Mrs. Malaprop from the unforgettable Dogberry of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. And whatever the source, Mrs. Malaprop is simply unique. And here are some typical examples of malapropism. And first one is her opinion on female education and characteristics of the attitude of the age. Here is unconscious irony in her own opinion, in that the language she employs here gives us a good indication of the kind of education she herself has received and of her pretension to use learned classical words. And this is another example of unconscious irony, which is virtually a kind of self condemnation of her egoism and vanity. She is so muddle headed and has not the wit to understand the mock compliments of Sir Anthony or Captain Absolute, and the slight comment of Sir Lucius when he criticizes the letter from his Delia. Malaprop's mistakes are many, and it seems there is some method in her madness. When the sounds of the two words are almost similar, except for a syllable or two or a few letters. And second example is were high sounding and bombastic classical words with meanings different from that of the intended words. And where she is not very far wrong, the meaning being a little far fetched or capable of being stretched to bear the meaning of intended. And next is where she happens to use a word having a contrary meaning to the one intended.